The Valori capital world was called Throne, and it had been the center of their empire for 15,000 years. Massive towers rose from the surface like metal fingers reaching toward the sky. Billions of citizens lived in its cities. The emperor himself resided in a palace that floated above the clouds, a symbol of power that every slave child learned to fear from birth. Danny Cole saw none of this beauty. He saw only the inside of a prison cell and the faces of guards who took pleasure in hurting him. They beat him for information about the rebellion. They used their scanning technology to search his memories. They found nothing useful because Danny had prepared for this. He had trained himself to think only about meaningless things when they probed his mind. He let them see memories of fixing machines and eating meals and sleeping in cold tunnels. He hid everything that mattered behind walls of boredom. The Festival of Dominion came 3 days after his arrival. It was an annual celebration of Valori supremacy, a week of parades and ceremonies that reminded the galaxy who ruled it. This year, the main entertainment would be the public execution of the human rebel who had caused so much trouble. Every screen in the Empire would broadcast his death. Danny counted the hours and waited. They dressed him in rags and put chains on his wrists and ankles. They paraded him through the streets of the capital on the back of an open transport, while crowds of Valori citizens jeered and threw things at him. Some of them had lost family members in the rebellion. Some of them simply enjoyed watching others suffer. Danny kept his eyes forward and said nothing. He was listening to the sound of his own heartbeat, counting down to 0. The execution platform stood in the central plaza before the floating palace. Millions watched from the surrounding towers. Billions more watched through screens across the empire. The emperor himself descended from his palace to witness the death of the human who had dared to challenge his rule. He was ancient and terrible, with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. He looked at Danny with curiosity. "You are smaller than I expected," the emperor said. "We thought you would be a monster. Instead, you are just a fragile little creature who made too much noise." Danny met his gaze. "Size is not everything." "Size is not everything." The emperor smiled. "True, but power is everything. And you have none." He gestured to the executioner, a massive Valori soldier with a ceremonial blade designed to remove heads in a single stroke. The blade was raised. The crowd fell silent. Every screen in the empire showed the moment that would end the rebellion forever. The moment never came. Across 12 systems, alarms began to sound. Slave camps erupted in coordinated uprisings as security systems failed and doors opened and weapons that should have been locked away were suddenly available. The information on Danny's hidden chip had reached every cell in the network. The codes worked. The plans worked. Everything worked. The screens in the plaza flickered. Instead of showing the execution, they showed images from across the empire. They showed slaves breaking their chains. They showed guards running from mobs of angry workers. They showed fires burning in places that had never seen resistance before. The broadcast technicians tried to cut the feed, but someone had taken control of the system. Someone on the inside thought the chaos in the plaza gave Danny his chance. The guards were distracted by the images on the screens. The executioner was staring at a transmission showing his own home district in flames. Danny moved. The chains on his wrists were designed to restrain species much stronger than humans. They were not designed to restrain a human who had spent 6 months practicing how to dislocate his own thumbs. Danny slipped free in less than 2 seconds and drove his knee into the executioner's groin before the massive soldier could react. He took the ceremonial blade and cut through his ankle chains with a single swing. The emperor's personal guards moved to intercept him, but they were too slow. Danny was already running toward the broadcast center at the edge of the plaza. The building was supposed to be secure, but the doors were open. Kithrani servants who had been waiting for this moment held them wide and waved him inside. Danny reached the main transmission console and looked at the controls. He had never operated Valori broadcast equipment before, but Kevin had made sure he knew the basics. He activated the system-wide override and saw his own face appear on every screen in the plaza, on every screen in the capital, on every screen in the Empire. He spoke. "My name is Danny Cole. I am a human. 18 months ago, I was sold as a slave for less than the price of a meal. The Valori called me worthless. They called my species genetic refuse. They thought we were too weak to matter." He paused and looked directly into the camera. They were wrong. We were never weak. We were waiting, learning, preparing, and now we are fighting back. Not just humans, all of us. Every species that has ever worn chains. Every being that has ever been told they were nothing. We are standing up together because we finally understand something important. Behind him, through the windows of the broadcast center, he could see the chaos spreading. The guards were fighting slaves. The crowds were scattering. The floating palace was descending as the Emperor tried to restore order. It was too late. "You cannot own people," Danny said. "You cannot buy and sell thinking beings like they are objects. You can try. You can use force and fear and cruelty to maintain control. But eventually, always, the oppressed will rise. And when they do, no amount of power will save you." They cut the transmission and walked out of the broadcast center. The plaza was a battlefield now. Kathrani servants and Droth workers and slaves of a dozen species were fighting against the guards with whatever they could find. Many of them were dying, but many of them were winning. The Emperor's guards finally reached Danny at the edge of the plaza. They surrounded him with weapons raised. Their commander stepped forward to give the order to fire. He hesitated. He was Keth Ronnie. Danny recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look Paula had given him on that first night in the slave quarters. It was the look of someone who had been told their whole life that they were worthless and had finally discovered it was a lie. "What do you want to do?" Danny asked quietly. The commander lowered his weapon. Behind him, one by one, the other guards did the same. They were not all Kathrani. Some were Valori. Some were species Danny had never seen before. It did not matter. They had all heard the broadcast. They had all seen the uprisings. They had all realized that the Empire was built on a foundation that was crumbling. The war did not end that day. It took another year of fighting and negotiation and sacrifice before the last chains were broken. The Valori Empire did not fall all at once. It cracked and fractured and slowly transformed into something new. When it was over, representatives from 30 formerly enslaved species gathered in a council chamber to form the Free Worlds Coalition. They offered Danny leadership of the new government. They said he had earned it. They said he had started everything. He refused. "I was just one man who refused to accept being worthless," he said. "Now there are billions of you. Lead yourselves. Build something better than what came before. Make sure no one ever wears chains again." He walked out of the chamber and found Paula waiting for him. She was older now, with scars on her arms from battles she had fought and wisdom in her eyes from decisions she had made. She had led the resistance on Nethera 6 after Danny left. She had become a hero in her own right. "Where will you go?" she asked. Danny looked at the sky. Somewhere beyond those clouds was a small blue world that he had not seen in almost 3 years. A world where his journey had begun. A world that needed to know what had happened and what was possible. "Home," he said. "It is time to bring this story home." Together, they boarded a ship and set course for Earth. Behind them, the Free Worlds Coalition began the long work of building a galaxy where no one would ever be sold again. Ahead of them, everything was new. 6 months in the wilderness taught Danny Cole what it meant to build something from nothing. The mountains of Nethar 6 were harsh and unforgiving. Food was scarce. Water had to be carried from distant streams. Every night brought cold that seeped into bones, and every day brought the threat of Valori patrols searching for the escaped slaves. Most rebellions would have died in those first weeks. This one grew. The ancient tunnels saved them. Danny had remembered what the Kethrani told him about the transportation network hidden beneath the surface. He led his followers underground, and they discovered passages that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The tunnels were old and dusty, but they were solid. They offered shelter from the weather and concealment from the patrols. Most importantly, they offered something that Danny had not expected. Connections. The network did not just cover Nethar 6. It reached across space to other worlds in other systems. The technology was beyond anything Danny had ever seen, but the principles were familiar enough. Power systems and control panels and transportation pods that had been waiting in silence for thousands of years. It took him 2 months to get the first connection working. When he did, everything changed. The rebels were no longer trapped on a single dying world. They could move between systems in minutes. They could appear where the Valori did not expect them and disappear before reinforcements arrived. They could reach other slave populations and spread the word that resistance was possible. Danny was not alone in this work. The first humans found him 3 weeks after the uprising at the estate. Their names were Linda Marsh and Kevin Park and Grace Webb. Linda had been a biologist on Earth before the raids. Kevin had been a structural engineer. Grace had been a trauma surgeon. They had escaped from a labor camp on a neighboring world after hearing rumors about a human who had killed a Valori commander. Together, the 4 humans became the core of something new. Linda studied the Valori biology and found weaknesses that no one had exploited before. She developed compounds from local plants that could disable the neural implants that the Valori used to enhance their reflexes. A single dose would leave a soldier confused and slow for hours. She taught the Kethrani how to make the compound and how to deliver it through contaminated food and water supplies. Kevin examined the tunnels and found ways to make them even more useful. He designed hidden shelters that were invisible to Valori scanning technology. He built collapse triggers that could seal passages behind pursuing soldiers. He created a network of safe houses that stretched across 3 systems. Every freed slave had somewhere to go. Every refugee had a place to hide. Grace kept people alive. The rebellion was dangerous, and wounds were common. Valori weapons left burns that standard medical knowledge could not treat. Grace learned by doing. She developed new techniques and trained others to use them. She saved lives that should have been lost. She became the reason that fighters kept fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible. Danny coordinated all of it. He planned the raids and chose the targets and made decisions that sent people into danger. Some of those people did not come back. He carried their names with him and tried to make their sacrifices mean something. The rebellion spread faster than anyone expected. Danny did not fight like the Valori anticipated. He did not try to hold territory or build an army that could face them in open battle. Instead, he attacked supply lines and freed slaves and destroyed infrastructure. Every raid included a broadcast that reached slave populations across the sector. The message was always the same: the masters can be beaten. The chains can be broken. You are not alone. The Valori High Command was confused at first. A few escaped slaves on a backwater world did not seem like a serious threat. They sent small forces to deal with the problem, and those forces were defeated or avoided. They sent larger forces, and those forces found nothing to attack. The rebels were ghosts. They struck without warning and vanished without a trace. The slave populations, who should have reported their movements, instead offered silence and protection. 6 months after the uprising, the rebellion had active cells in 12 systems. Thousands of former slaves had been freed. Dozens of Valori outposts had been destroyed. The High Command finally understood that this was not a minor inconvenience. This was an existential threat. They sent the Silence. The Silence was an elite hunter unit designed for exactly this kind of problem. They had crushed rebellions on 100 worlds. They were faster and stronger and better equipped than any regular soldiers. They did not capture targets. They eliminated them. Their commander was given a single order: find a human called Danny Cole and make an example of him. Danny knew they were coming. His network had informants in the Valori military who warned him about the deployment. He knew that running would only delay the inevitable. The Silence would hunt him across the galaxy. They would kill everyone who helped him. They would not stop until he was dead. He decided not to run. The trap was set in a canyon on the edge of Nathara 6. Danny let the Silence find him there with 50 of his best fighters. He let them surround him. He let them think they had finally cornered the leader of the rebellion. Then he surrendered. The Silence commander was suspicious. This was too easy. But Danny was clearly the target, and his capture would end the war. The commander accepted the surrender and ordered Danny transported to the capital world for public execution. The other rebels were to be killed immediately. Linda and Kevin and Grace watched from hiding as Danny was loaded onto a transport ship. They had argued against this plan. They had begged him to let someone else take the risk. He had refused. The plan required the real Danny Cole. It required the face that every slave in the sector had seen on the broadcasts. It required the symbol. What the Valori did not know was that Danny's surrender was not a defeat. It was a delivery system. Hidden inside his body was a data chip smaller than a grain of rice. The chip contained the locations and security codes for 12 major slave camps across the empire. It contained detailed plans for coordinated uprisings timed to a specific moment. It contained instructions for cells that had been preparing for months. Danny had not been captured. He had inserted himself into the heart of the enemy. Grace had implanted the chip in a location that Valori scanners would not detect. Kevin had designed the encryption that protected its contents. Linda had developed the biological coding that kept Danny's body from rejecting it. The plan had been in motion since the day they met. As the transport ship carried Danny toward the capital, Linda activated the communication network. Across 12 systems, resistance cells received the signal they had been waiting for. The countdown had begun. 1 year changed everything. The estate that had been dying was now thriving. The fields produced more food than they had in decades. The machines ran smoothly and rarely broke down. The Kethrani workers moved with purpose and confidence instead of despair. Torvak Shen had become the envy of every noble on Nethera 6, and he had no idea why. Danny Cole knew exactly why. He had rebuilt the estate piece by piece while staying invisible. He had fixed problems that the Valori did not even know existed. He had taught the Kethrani workers skills that transformed them from helpless slaves into capable technicians. All of this happened in the shadows, in the quiet hours between sunset and sunrise, in the spaces that the masters never bothered to look. But success brought attention. The regional authorities noticed that a failing estate had suddenly become the most productive in the sector. They sent an inspection team to find out how. Commander Dreth arrived on a gray morning with 6 armed soldiers and 2 scanning technicians. He was tall, even for a Valori, with cold eyes and a reputation for cruelty that made even other commanders uncomfortable. He had put down slave rebellions on 3 worlds. He had personally executed thousands of beings who dared to resist the Empire. He looked at the thriving fields of the Shen estate and immediately knew something was wrong. "This is impossible," he said to Torvax. "Your yields have increased by 400% in 1 year. Your equipment failure rate has dropped to nearly 0. Explain this to me." Torvak stammered and made excuses. He talked about favorable weather and good fortune and his own brilliant management. Dreth did not believe a word of it. He ordered his technicians to scan every machine on the estate. He told his soldiers to search every building. He wanted answers. Danny watched from the fields as the soldiers moved through the compound. He knew what they would find. Every modification he had made bore his signature. Every improvement reflected human engineering principles that the Valori had never seen before. There was no way to hide what he had done. There was no way to explain it away. He had two choices. He could run and abandon everyone who had trusted him, or he could stand and face whatever came next. Danny walked toward the main house. The technicians were already confused when he arrived. They had opened one of the harvesting machines and found systems that should not exist. The modifications were elegant and efficient and completely alien to their understanding. They were arguing about what it meant when Danny stepped forward. "I did it," he said clearly. "All of it." The room went silent. Every Valori turned to look at the human slave who had just confessed to something impossible. Dreth pushed through the crowd and stood in front of Danny with his hand on his weapon. "You," he said slowly. "You are the one." "Yes." Dreth studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "A human engineer. I did not know such a thing existed." He turned to his soldiers. "Bring me an engine core from one of the transport ships. The one that was damaged in the landing." The soldiers obeyed. They returned minutes later with a complex piece of machinery, a sphere of metal and crystal that pulsed with failing light. The Valori used these cores to power their faster-than-light drives. They were incredibly sophisticated and incredibly difficult to repair. Most technicians needed special tools and weeks of time to fix one. Dreth dropped the engine core at Danny's feet. "Fix it," he said. "You have 1 hour. If you succeed, I will believe that you are what you claim. If you fail, I will have you executed for lying to a commander of the Empire." Danny looked at the engine core. He had never seen one before. He had no idea how it worked. But he had studied Valori technology for over a year. He understood their design philosophy. He knew their strengths and their weaknesses. And most importantly, he could see the damage clearly. He knelt down and got to work. The watching Valori expected him to fail. They whispered among themselves about the foolish human who had sealed his own death. They waited for him to give up and beg for mercy. Instead, they watched him disassemble the core with steady hands and systematic precision. They watched him identify the damaged components and find solutions using parts from his own toolkit. They watched him rebuild the core in a way that was different from any repair they ever seen. 20 minutes later, Danny stood up. The engine core glowed with steady light. He had not just fixed it. He had improved it. "The efficiency is 40% higher than the original design," he said quietly. "You are welcome." Dreth was not smiling anymore. He looked at Danny with something new in his eyes. It was not respect. It was fear. "Kill him," he said to his soldiers. "Kill him now." Danny did not move. He had expected this. He had known from the moment he stepped forward that this was a possibility. But he had also known something else. He had known that the Kethrani workers were watching. He had known that they would see what happened next. He had known that this moment would define everything. The soldiers raised their weapons. No, the word came from behind them. Paula stood in the doorway with a farming tool in her hands. Behind her were 20 Kethrani workers. Behind them were 20 more. They filled the corridor and spilled out into the yard. They had come to watch the inspection, and they had seen everything. They had seen the human who saved their harvest confess to save them from punishment. They had seen him prove his worth beyond any doubt. They had seen him face death with dignity. They would not let him die alone. "You will have to kill all of us," Paula said. Her voice shook, but did not break. "Every single one." Dreth looked at the crowd of slaves blocking his way. He calculated the cost of killing them all. He calculated the paperwork and the lost productivity and the questions from his superiors. He calculated wrong. He ordered his soldiers to fire. The Kethrani did not run. They charged. What happened next was chaos. The soldiers were trained for battlefield combat, not close quarters fighting with desperate slaves. The Kethrani had no weapons, but they had numbers and fury and something else that Dreth had never anticipated. They had hope. Danny moved through the chaos with purpose. He reached Dreth before the commander could draw his sidearm. The farming tool in his hand was designed for cutting thick stems and heavy roots. It worked just as well on Valori armor. When it was over, 6 Valori soldiers lay dead. Commander Dreth lay dead. 14 Kethrani had given their lives. The survivors stood in the blood-soaked courtyard and looked at each other with wide eyes. They had just killed their masters. There was no going back from this. Danny cleaned the blood from his hands and looked at the sky. In the distance, he could see lights descending through the clouds. More ships. More soldiers. The Valori would send an army to crush this uprising before it could spread. He turned to the surviving Kethrani. "Anyone who wants to leave should go now," he said. "Find somewhere safe. Hide. Forget this ever happened." No one moved. Paula stepped forward. "Where will you go?" Danny looked toward the hills beyond the estate. He thought about the ancient tunnels beneath their feet. He thought about the network that connected this dying world to dozens of others. He thought about all the slaves across the galaxy who were waiting for someone to show them the resistance was possible. "Into the mountains," he said, "to build something new." 40 Kethrani followed him into the wilderness. Behind them, the estate burned. Ahead of them, everything was uncertain. But for the first time in a very long time, they were free. Nathar 6 was a world that had forgotten how to live. The soil was gray and tired. The rivers ran thin and slow. The sky hung low with clouds that never seemed to bring rain. Danny Cole stepped off the transport ship and felt the dry wind on his face and understood immediately why Torvax Shen had been so desperate for workers. This land was dying, and everyone who worked it was dying with it. The estate was large but falling apart. The main house had cracks in its walls and broken windows covered with sheets of plastic. The farming equipment sat rusted in open fields. The storage buildings leaned at dangerous angles. Torvax had inherited all of this from a wealthy ancestor and had spent the last 20 years watching it crumble. He had no money to fix it and no knowledge of how to do so himself. The Valori were conquerors, not farmers. They took wealth from others but rarely knew how to create it themselves. Danny was put to work immediately. His job was to maintain the harvesting machines, ancient vehicles that crawled across the fields and collected whatever meager crops the exhausted soil could produce. The machines were poorly designed and constantly breaking down. The previous maintenance workers, a team of Kethrani slaves, had done their best, but they had no training in advanced mechanics. They kept the machines running, but never understood why they failed so often. Danny understood. He spent his first week simply observing. He studied the machines during the day and thought about them at night. He identified the design flaws and calculated the solutions. The Valori, who had built these harvesters, had made them complicated when they should have been simple. They had added unnecessary systems and created points of failure that could have been avoided. It was sloppy engineering. It was wasteful. On his 8th day, Danny made his first modification. He removed a redundant cooling system from one of the harvesters and replaced it with a simpler design using parts from a broken irrigation pump. The change took him 3 hours. When he finished, the harvester ran 30% faster and used half as much fuel. He made similar modifications to 2 more machines over the following week. Torvax noticed that his yields had improved. He assumed the weather had been favorable. He never considered that a human slave might be responsible. Danny let him believe whatever he wanted. The Kethrani workers were different. They watched Danny work, and they saw what he was doing. At first, they were afraid of him. The Kethrani were a gentle species, small and thin with large dark eyes and fingers made for delicate work. They had heard stories about humans. They had heard that humans were violent predators who killed for pleasure. They kept their distance and spoke about Danny in whispers that one of them was braver than the others. Her name was Paula, and she was young, barely an adult by Kethrani standards. She approached Danny one evening while he was eating his ration of nutrient paste in the slave quarters. She stood at a safe distance and watched him for several minutes before speaking. "You fixed the harvester," she said. Her voice was soft and careful. "I saw you." Danny looked up at her. "Yes, the masters do not know. No." Paula was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her woolen clothing and pulled out a small tool, a cutting device with a cracked handle. "This is broken. My father used it before he died. Can you fix it?" Danny took the tool and examined it. The power cell was dead and the blade alignment was off. It would take him 10 minutes to repair. He nodded and got to work while Paula watched. When he finished, he handed it back to her. She tested it on a piece of scrap material, and the blade cut clean and true. She looked at Danny with something new in her eyes. It was not fear anymore. It was curiosity. "Why do you help?" she asked. "We are nothing to you." Danny thought about the question. He thought about the mining outpost on the moon and the friends he had lost. He thought about the other humans scattered across the galaxy in cages and work camps. He thought about the young woman at the transport dock who had whispered to him in passing. He thought about all the reasons he had to hate everyone and everything around him. "Because you asked," he said simply. Word spread among the Kethrani workers. The human was not a monster. The human could fix things. The human would help if you approached him carefully. Within a month, Danny had repaired dozens of tools and devices that the Kethrani had been struggling with for years. He taught them simple techniques and showed them how to maintain their own equipment. He shared his food rations with those who had less. He listened to their problems and offered solutions when he could. The Kethrani began to trust him. They began to tell him things. They told him about the ancient tunnels beneath the estate, transportation passages from a civilization that had existed long before the Valori arrived. They told him that Nethora 6 had once been a junction point in a network that connected dozens of worlds. The Valori had never discovered this. They had never bothered to look. Danny filed this information away for later. The dry season came and the crops began to fail. The streams that fed the fields slowed to a trickle. Torvax grew desperate. He would lose everything if the harvest did not survive. Danny approached him with a proposal, a simple irrigation system that would redirect water from an underground source he had discovered while exploring the tunnels. Torvax laughed at him. What could a human know about irrigation? What could a piece of grade F genetic refuse teach a Valori noble? He dismissed Danny with a wave and told him to get back to work. Danny built the system anyway. He worked at night with help from Paula and a dozen other Kethrani who believed in him. They dug channels and laid pipes and connected everything to a pump that Danny assembled from salvaged parts. It took them 3 weeks. When they finished, water flowed into the dying fields for the first time in years. The harvest was saved. Torvax Shen took credit for the success. He told the other nobles that he had discovered a new technique. He accepted their praise and their envy. He never mentioned the human who had actually done the work, but the Kethrani knew. They all knew. On the night after the harvest was complete, Paula came to Danny in the slave quarters. She sat beside him in the darkness and spoke quietly. "The others are talking," she said. "They say you are different. They say you are not like the masters." Danny looked at her. "What do you think?" Paula was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched his hand, a gesture of trust that Kethrani rarely offered to outsiders. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are exactly what we have been waiting for." The holding cell smelled like rust and fear. Danny Cole sat in the corner with his back against the cold metal wall and watched the aliens walk past his cage. They never looked at him for long. Their eyes would find him, study him for a moment, and then move on to something more interesting. He had been here for 3 months, and he had learned what that look meant. It meant he was worthless. The station was called The Drift. It was a massive structure that floated in the empty space between 2 dying stars. Thousands of cages lined its corridors. Thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds waited inside those cages to be sold. The Valori Empire had been doing this for 10,000 years. They conquered worlds, took the populations they wanted, and sold the rest. It was business to them. Nothing personal. Danny was 34 years old. Back on Earth, he had been a mechanic at a mining outpost on the dark side of the moon. He fixed machines. He kept things running. He had been good at his job. None of that mattered now. The Valori had raided the outpost 6 months ago. They killed anyone who fought back and took everyone else. Danny had watched his friends die. He had watched his world disappear through the window of a cargo ship. Now he was just another piece of merchandise, waiting for a buyer. The problem was that no one wanted to buy a human. The Valori had scanned him when he first arrived. They measured his bones and tested his blood and looked inside his brain. Their machines told them everything they needed to know. Humans had no telepathic abilities. Humans had no natural armor or claws or venom. Humans lived short lives and broke easily. Compared to the other species in the galaxy, humans were nothing special. The Valori marked him as Grade F stock and threw him in a cage with the other rejects. Every few days, buyers would come through the holding area. They were merchants and nobles and factory owners looking for workers. They would examine the merchandise and make their selections. Danny watched them take droth miners with their thick hides and 4 arms. He watched them take Kethrani farmers with their delicate fingers and patient minds. He watched them take species he had no names for, beings with scales and feathers and skin that changed color. No one ever took the humans. There were 12 humans left from his outpost. There had been 20 when they arrived. 8 had been sold to a chemical processing plant on a poison world. Danny heard they lasted 2 weeks before the air killed them. The Valori who ran the drift had been annoyed. Dead slaves meant unhappy customers. They stopped selling humans for dangerous work after that. Now they could not sell them at all. Danny used the time to learn. He listened to the guards talk and slowly began to understand their language. He watched the technicians maintain the station and memorized how their machines worked. He studied the routines and the schedules and the weaknesses in the security systems. The Valori never noticed. They saw a quiet human sitting in a cage and assumed his spirit was broken. They were wrong. On the 93rd day, a buyer finally came for him. His name was Torvak Shen, and he was clearly not wealthy. His clothes were old, and his ship was small, and the other Valori merchants laughed at him when he walked past. He was a minor noble from a dying world, desperate for workers, but unable to afford the good ones. He stopped in front of Danny's cage and looked at him for a long time. "This one," Torvak said. "How much?" The slave master checked his records and made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That is a human. Grade F. I will give it to you for the cost of its food bill." Torvax paid the price. It was barely enough to buy a meal at a decent restaurant. Danny was worth less than dinner. The other merchants thought Torvax was a fool. They told him so as he completed the transaction. A human would be useless on a farm. A human would die in the first season. A human was genetic refuse, a mistake of evolution, a species that should have been left to rot on its primitive little world. Torvax ignored them. He needed workers, and he could not afford to be selective. Danny was fitted with a control collar and led to the transport dock. The collar could deliver a shock strong enough to stop his heart. All slaves wore them. All slaves knew better than to test them. Danny followed his new owner without resistance and kept his eyes on the ground. He was the perfect image of a broken man, but he was watching everything. He counted the guards and noted their weapons. He studied the layout of the corridors and the placement of the security stations. He observed which systems were automated and which required manual control. He filed every detail away in his memory. The Valari thought he was stupid. They thought he was harmless. They thought he was nothing. At the transport dock, Danny saw another group of humans being loaded onto a different ship. They were going to a mining colony in the outer systems. Their faces were empty and their shoulders were slumped. They had given up. But one of them, a young woman with short dark hair, caught his eye as she passed. She held his gaze for just a moment. Then she leaned close and whispered something that the guards did not hear. "They have no idea what we are." Danny did not react. He kept walking toward his transport ship. He kept his face blank and his body submissive. But inside, something changed. He was not alone. Somewhere out there, other humans were watching and waiting and learning. Somewhere out there, others understood what he understood. The Valari had made a mistake. They had looked at humanity and seen weakness. They had measured human bodies and found them fragile. They had scanned human minds and found them limited. But they had missed something important. They had missed the thing that made humans dangerous. They had missed the patience. They had missed the adaptability. They had missed the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Danny Cole boarded the transport ship and sat down in the cargo hold with the other slaves. Torvax Shen sealed the doors and set course for his estate on a world called Nathara 6. The journey would take 3 days. Danny closed his eyes and began to plan. He did not know what waited for him on Nathara 6. He did not know if he would survive the first month. He did not know if he would ever see Earth again. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not worthless. And someday, the Valori would learn exactly what a human could do.